You think you know what luxury means? Designer clothes, fine dining, maybe a private jet if you're really living it up? Well, let me tell you something that'll make your stomach turn and your mind question everything you thought you knew about the good old days. Tonight, while you're scrolling through your phone in your comfortable ignorance, I'm going to show you what really happened behind the golden doors of European palaces. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a fancy restaurant the same way again. Picture this. It's 1547, and you're walking through the corridors of Hampton Court Palace. The air is thick with something that isn't just expensive perfume. It's the sweet, cloying scent of human waste mixed with rose petals and lavender. Because here's what they don't teach you in history class. The nobility of Europe lived in their own filth, and they made it an art form. King Henry VIII, that bloated monster you know from paintings, had a position in his court called the Groom of the Stool. Sounds fancy, right? This poor soul's job was to literally wipe the king's backside after he relieved himself. But wait, it gets worse. This wasn't considered degrading. It was one of the most coveted positions in the entire kingdom. Why? Because while you were kneeling there, cleaning royal excrement, you had the king's undivided attention. You could whisper secrets, make requests, destroy enemies. Power literally flowed from the throne to your hands, covered in, well, you get the picture. The French took this obsession with bodily functions to even more disturbing heights. At Versailles, that glittering palace of mirrors and madness, courtiers would follow Louis XIV into his private chambers not just to dress him, but to watch him defecate. They called it the lever, the rising ceremony. Imagine dozens of powdered, perfumed aristocrats fighting for the privilege to observe their son king's morning bowel movement. The closer you stood, the higher your status. The smell of royal waste became the perfume of power. But the truly nauseating part wasn't just the voyeurism, it was the competition. Nobles would arrive hours early, bribing servants, forming alliances, all for the chance to hand the king his chamber pot. Some spent their entire fortunes just to be in that room, breathing in the monarch's morning emissions. They believed that proximity to royal bodily functions would somehow transfer divine right to them. Think about that the next time you complain about your job. The English weren't much better. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, had teeth so rotten from her sugar addiction that foreign ambassadors could smell her breath from across the room. But here's the twisted part. The courtiers began deliberately rotting their own teeth to match hers. They would rub sugar directly under their gums, creating festering sores and blackened stumps, all because they thought it made them look more refined, more royal. Imagine choosing to disfigure yourself just to fit in with someone whose mouth was literally decomposing. The Spanish court had its own brand of madness. Philip II kept detailed records of his bowel movements, treating them like state documents. His courtiers would analyze the consistency, color, and frequency of royal excrement, like they were reading tea leaves. Bad digestion meant bad omens for the kingdom. A particularly solid movement could launch military campaigns. The fate of nations hung on the contents of a chamber pot. And the Italians? The Medici family turned poison into a dinner party game. They would invite guests to elaborate feasts where everyone knew someone might not make it to dessert. Servants would taste every dish, but that wasn't for the diner's safety. It was for the entertainment. Watching a servant convulse and foam at the mouth before the main course was considered the height of sophisticated dining. The guests would make bets on which dish would claim its victim first. But perhaps the most disturbing custom was the practice of tasting in the Austrian court. Not food, people. Courtiers would literally lick each other's skin to determine their social status. The theory was that noble blood had a different flavor than common blood, and you could taste the difference through the skin. Imagine arriving at a party and having to submit to being licked by strangers who were trying to figure out if you belonged there. The smell alone in these palaces would have knocked you unconscious. With no proper sanitation, hundreds of people living in close quarters, and the belief that bathing was actually harmful to your health, the stench was so overwhelming that courtiers carried around little bouquets called tussie-mussies, not for decoration, but to hold under their noses so they wouldn't vomit from the smell of their own luxury. These weren't isolated incidents or exaggerations. They were daily life for the most powerful people in Europe. The very foundations of what we call civilization were built on a swamp of human degradation that makes your worst day at work look like a spa retreat. But this story doesn't end in dusty history books. The next time you see someone desperately trying to get close to power, sucking up to their boss, humiliating themselves for a promotion, remember the groom of the stool, remember the courtiers fighting to smell royal waste, and realize how little we've actually changed. We've just gotten better at hiding the stench. You thought that was disturbing? You haven't seen anything yet, because what I just told you about bodily functions and personal hygiene was just the appetizer. Now let me serve you the main course. A feast of cruelty that will make you question whether human beings deserve to call themselves civilized at all. Let's talk about entertainment. When you're bored, you might watch Netflix or scroll through social media. When European nobility got bored, they tortured people for fun. And I don't mean metaphorically. I mean they literally gathered their friends, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, and watched human beings get torn apart like it was dinner theater. The court of Catherine de' Medici in France turned executions into social events that would put modern award shows to shame. Picture this. Silk pavilions erected around execution squares, servants passing around wine and delicacies, while convicted criminals were slowly dismembered in front of cheering crowds of the most refined people in Europe. Catherine herself would sit in the front row, sometimes bringing her children, pointing out the interesting anatomical details as executioners peeled skin from living bodies like they were preparing fruit. But here's what makes your skin crawl. They didn't just watch random executions. They commissioned custom tortures like they were ordering bespoke clothing. A noble might request that their enemy be broken on the wheel in a specific pattern, with precise timing for each bone break, turning human agony into performance art. They would take notes, comparing techniques, rating executioners on their creativity and showmanship. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just about religious persecution, it was the ultimate entertainment for the aristocracy. Spanish nobles would attend auto da fe ceremonies like opera performances, complete with reserved seating, programs listing the evening's victims, and intermission refreshments. They would dress in their most expensive clothes to watch heretics burn alive, treating the screams of the dying like a symphony orchestra. Cardinal Albani in Rome went one step further. He collected torture devices like modern billionaires collect art. His palace basement was a museum of human suffering, iron maidens, thumbscrews, devices designed to slowly crush every bone in the human body. But he didn't just display them, he used them. Dinner parties at his residence would end with guests retiring to the basement to watch servants demonstrate the devices on prisoners. The more creative the agony, the more sophisticated the evening was considered. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1572 that will haunt your dreams. During the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris, French nobility didn't just participate in the slaughter of Protestants, they turned it into a fashion show. Noble ladies wore white dresses, specifically designed to show bloodstains, competing to see who could get the most creative splatter patterns. They would pose for portraits with their blood-soaked gowns, treating mass murder like a costume party theme. The Duke of Alba in the Netherlands created what he called living statues. He would have his soldiers capture enemy combatants and torture them into specific poses, then cover them with plaster while they were still alive, creating sculptures of human agony that would slowly suffocate their subjects. These artworks decorated his palace gardens, and guests would stroll among them after dinner, admiring the craftsmanship, while listening to the muffled screams from inside the plaster. But perhaps the most stomach-churning custom was practiced by Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who believed that bathing in the blood of young girls would preserve her beauty. This wasn't some primitive superstition, this was a scientifically planned beauty regimen practiced by one of the most educated women in Europe. She would drain her victims slowly, keeping them alive as long as possible to ensure the blood stayed fresh and warm. Her bathroom was designed like a slaughterhouse, with drains and collection pools, where she would soak for hours while servants scrubbed her with brushes dipped in human blood. The truly horrifying part wasn't just the murders, it was how she recruited accomplices. Bathory convinced local clergy that she was performing holy rituals, told physicians she was conducting medical research, and persuaded other noble ladies that this was the latest beauty treatment from Italy. She turned mass murder into a spa day, complete with herbal oils mixed with human blood and massage techniques that involved literally bathing in the life force of teenage girls. German princes had their own twisted entertainment. They would stage elaborate hunts using human prey. Criminals, political prisoners, and sometimes just random peasants would be released into the woods, given a head start, then hunted like animals by mounted nobility with packs of trained dogs. The twist? The humans were often dressed as specific animals, bears, boars, stags, complete with costumes and masks. The hunters would then display their trophies, human heads mounted like deer, in their trophy rooms. The French court developed something called living chess, where prisoners of war would be forced to act as chess pieces on giant boards. When a piece was captured, the corresponding human would be executed on the spot in the manner that piece had been taken. A bishop taken by a knight might be trampled by horses. A pawn captured by a rook might be crushed by stones. Marie Antoinette herself was known to play several games in an evening, treating human lives like disposable game tokens. Italian city-states created elaborate execution festivals that lasted for days. The Borgias in Rome would flood the Colosseum and stage naval battles using condemned prisoners as sailors, watching them drown in the artificially created lake while eating 7-course meals. They would bet on which prisoners would last longest, which would try to swim to safety, which would attempt to kill their fellow victims first. But here's what really makes your blood run cold. These weren't secret activities hidden from public view. These were the height of social sophistication. Nobles would compete to host the most creative torture events. They would send invitations written on parchment made from human skin. They would serve food prepared by chefs who had learned their knife skills by dissecting living prisoners. They transformed human suffering into high art, and the more refined you were, the more elaborate your cruelty was expected to be. The smell of burning flesh became as common at noble gatherings as the smell of roasting meat. The sound of human screams was background music to their conversations about philosophy and art. They would discuss the finer points of literature while watching human beings get slowly cooked alive, treating torture like a wine tasting, analyzing the bouquet of terror, comparing vintage screams, developing sophisticated palettes for human agony. And the children? Noble children were raised to see this as normal. They would have their first torture viewing as a coming-of-age ceremony, like a debutante ball made of human horror. 5-year-old princes would be given tiny whips to practice on servants. Noble daughters would receive jewelry boxes that played music, while tiny mechanical figures enacted miniature executions inside. These weren't monsters hiding in the shadows of history. These were the most powerful, educated, refined people of their time. The ones who commissioned great art, built magnificent cathedrals, and created the cultural foundations of modern Europe. They did it all while literally bathing in human blood and treating torture like entertainment, but this legacy didn't die with them. The next time you watch a violent movie and feel that little thrill of excitement, the next time you slow down to look at a car accident, the next time you find yourself drawn to tragedy and suffering disguised as entertainment, remember Countess Bathory and her bloodbath. Remember the nobles cheering at executions. And ask yourself, what exactly separates us from them besides better marketing? You think you've heard the worst of it? That bloodthirsty entertainment was the bottom of the barrel of human depravity? You're adorably naive, because what I'm about to tell you will make those torture parties look like children's birthday celebrations. We need to talk about what happened when European nobility got creative with their most basic human function, reproduction. Let me paint you a picture that will scar your mind forever. It's 1685, and you're standing in the birthing chamber of Versailles, watching the future heir to the French throne being born. But you're not alone. There are 47 other people crammed into this room, watching every intimate detail of the Queen's labor. Dukes, duchesses, foreign ambassadors, church officials, and random courtiers who paid enough to get in, all staring at a woman's most vulnerable moment like it's a sporting event. This wasn't medical necessity, this was entertainment. Royal births were public spectacles where the nobility would place bets on the baby's sex, the duration of labor, and whether the mother would survive. They would eat elaborate meals while the Queen screamed in agony, treating her pain like dinner music. Some nobles would bring portable chairs and blankets, settling in for what they hoped would be a long, dramatic show. But here's the truly disturbing part. They didn't just watch, they participated. Court physicians would allow nobles to assist in the delivery, letting them feel the baby's head crowning, letting them cut the umbilical cord like they were carving a roast. Some queens had their babies touched by dozens of unwashed hands before they took their first breath, all because every noble wanted to claim they helped deliver the future monarch. Marie Antoinette's birth was so crowded that she nearly suffocated from lack of air. The room was packed with sweating bodies, the windows were sealed shut to prevent evil spirits from entering, and nobles were literally climbing on furniture to get a better view. When she finally gave birth, the baby was passed around the room like a trophy, with each noble taking turns holding the bloody, screaming infant while photographers, yes, they had early photography by then, captured the moment for posterity. The English took this voyeurism to even more twisted levels. When royal consummation ceremonies were performed, where the nobility would literally watch the king and queen have sex to ensure the marriage was properly completed, they would provide commentary like sports announcers. They would discuss technique, endurance, and performance, while two people tried to be intimate with dozens of eyes, watching their every movement. Henry VIII's wedding nights were attended by up to 60 courtiers who would remain in the bedchamber throughout the entire consummation, taking notes on the proceedings that would later be read aloud at court gatherings. Imagine trying to be romantic while elderly men in powdered wigs sat 3 feet away, writing down every sound you made, every position you attempted, every moment of awkwardness or passion. But the German courts developed something even more nauseating: breeding competitions. Noble families would arrange marriages not just for political alliance, but as literal breeding contests. They would track fertility like livestock records, keeping detailed charts of conception dates, pregnancy duration, and infant survival rates. The family that produced the most surviving heirs within a set time period would win land grants and political favors. These competitions turned pregnancy into a blood sport. Pregnant noble women would be monitored constantly by rival families looking for signs of miscarriage or birth defects. They would have food tasters not to prevent poisoning, but to ensure they were eating fertility-enhancing diets. Some would be confined to breeding chambers for months, treated like prize cattle being prepared for market. The Habsburg family took inbreeding to such extreme levels that their children were born with deformities that would make you sick to your stomach. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, had a jaw so malformed he couldn't chew food, a tongue so large he couldn't speak clearly and was likely impotent, but the family kept trying to breed him because maintaining pure bloodlines was more important than basic human health. They would arrange viewing parties where nobles could observe the physically deformed royal children like they were exotic animals in a zoo. Charles II was displayed at court functions despite being unable to walk properly or control his bodily functions, because his genetic disasters were considered proof of divine bloodline purity. Nobles would comment on his deformities like they were discussing fine art, analyzing which features came from which royal ancestors. Italian city-states created elaborate fertility rituals that were essentially organized orgies disguised as religious ceremonies. The Medici family would host blessing of the womb, ceremonies where pregnant noble women would be stripped naked and examined by male clergy, while other nobles watched and offered prayers for successful births. These ceremonies often devolved into sexual free-for-alls where the line between religious ritual and group sex completely disappeared. The Catholic Church not only permitted these practices, but actively encouraged them, claiming that public conception ceremonies would ensure divine blessing on royal bloodlines. Priests would literally bless the genitals of noble couples before they had sex, sometimes remaining in the room to ensure the act was performed correctly according to church doctrine. French noblewomen developed a custom called pregnancy competition, where they would deliberately time their pregnancies to give birth during major court events, turning labor into performance art. They would compete to see who could give birth in the most dramatic fashion. During a ball, in the middle of a feast, or even during church services, the more public and disruptive the birth, the more attention and favor they would receive from the king. Some would induce early labor using dangerous herbs and techniques just to ensure their delivery coincided with important celebrations. They would risk their lives, and their babies' lives, for a few moments of royal attention, treating childbirth like a publicity stunt centuries before social media made such behavior commonplace. The Spanish court developed virginity verification ceremonies, where young noble women would be publicly examined by court physicians to confirm their purity before marriage arrangements. These examinations were attended by the girl's entire extended family, future in-laws, and often random nobles who paid for the privilege of watching. 12-year-old girls would be stripped naked and physically examined while dozens of adults watched and commented on their development. These examinations were so invasive and traumatic that many young women never recovered psychologically. Some would be rejected for marriage based on physical imperfections discovered during these public inspections, ruining their lives before they were even old enough to understand what was happening to them. But perhaps the most disturbing custom was practiced by Russian nobility. They would steal peasant babies to use as practiced children for their own offspring. Noble children would be given peasant infants to parent as a way of learning responsibility, but when they got bored or made mistakes, the peasant babies would simply be discarded or killed. These practiced children were treated as disposable toys, with noble children learning that human life had no value unless it came with a title. The mortality rate for these practiced babies was nearly 100%, but the custom continued for generations because it was considered essential education for future rulers. Noble children would go through dozens of peasant infants during their childhood, leaving a trail of tiny corpses that no one bothered to count or remember. And here's what should make you lose sleep tonight. They documented everything. Detailed records exist of every public birth, every breeding competition, every virginity examination, every discarded practice baby. They were proud of these customs. They considered them the height of civilization and sophistication. These weren't primitive barbarians operating in ignorance. These were the most educated, cultured, refined people of their era. They built magnificent palaces, commissioned beautiful art, and created complex philosophical systems while simultaneously treating human reproduction like a livestock breeding program designed for their personal entertainment. But this sickness didn't stay buried in medieval castles. The next time you see reality TV shows about teen pregnancies, the next time you witness strangers commenting on celebrities' bodies during pregnancy, the next time you see people treating other people's intimate moments as public entertainment, remember those crowded birthing chambers at Versailles. Remember the nobles betting on royal labor pain, and realize that we've simply moved the audience from palace rooms to glowing screens. You're probably thinking you can't possibly sink any deeper into this abyss of human depravity. You're wrong, because now we need to talk about what European nobility did with their food. And I promise you, after this, you'll never look at a fancy restaurant the same way again. What I'm about to reveal will make you question every meal you've ever considered luxurious. Let me take you to a dinner party at the court of Pope Alexander VI in 1501. The smell hits you first, not the aroma of roasted meat or fine wine, but something else entirely. Something that makes your stomach turn even before you see what's on the golden plates. Because tonight's specialty isn't beef or pork or chicken. Tonight, the main course is human flesh, prepared by the finest chefs in Rome and served to the most powerful people in Europe. This wasn't some primitive ritual or desperate survival situation. This was haute cuisine. The Borgias had turned cannibalism into gourmet dining, complete with wine pairings and elaborate presentation. They would select their victims based on age and diet, aging the meat like fine wine, treating human flesh like premium Wagyu beef. Young peasants who had been fed specific diets for months were considered the ultimate delicacy. The preparation was an art form that would make modern molecular gastronomy look primitive. They would bleed their victims slowly to improve the meat's texture, keep them alive as long as possible to prevent rigor mortis from affecting the flavor, and use every part of the body in different courses. The brain would be served as a delicate pâté, the heart as a main course, the liver prepared with onions and herbs like it was coming from any other animal. But here's what makes your blood freeze. They had etiquette rules for eating people. Proper nobles would use specific utensils for different body parts, follow prescribed order for consuming organs, and discuss the flavor profiles like they were tasting wine. They would comment on the subtle differences between male and female flesh, debate whether fear or contentment affected the meat's taste, and rate different body parts like cuts of steak. Cardinal Cesare Borgia kept detailed culinary notes about his human meals, describing which herbs best complemented brain tissue, which cooking methods produced the most tender heart meat, and which wines paired best with various organs. These recipes were shared among the European elite like modern cookbook exchanges, with nobles competing to discover new ways to prepare human flesh. The French court took this culinary horror to even more twisted heights. Catherine de' Medici introduced what she called mystery meat, dinner parties, where guests would be served elaborate dishes without being told what animal they were eating. The game was to guess the source of the meat based on taste and texture alone. The twist? Some dishes were human, some were animal, and guests would have to identify which was which while they ate. The winner of these guessing games would be awarded a special prize, the opportunity to select the next victim personally. They would tour the palace dungeons like they were shopping at a butcher shop, examining prisoners for the best meat quality, discussing their preferences with the chef, who would then prepare their selection according to their exact specifications. English nobility developed something even more nauseating. They would host living banquets, where the meal would be prepared and served while the source was still alive. Victims would be partially butchered, with non-essential parts removed and cooked while they watched their own flesh being prepared and eaten by their captors. The psychological torture was considered as important as the culinary experience. Henry VIII himself was known to have hosted these living banquets, where he would personally select which parts of a prisoner to have removed and cooked first. He would engage in conversation with his victims while eating their flesh, asking them to rate the seasoning, discussing their cooking preferences, treating them like willing participants in their own consumption. German princes created elaborate harvest festivals, where they would capture entire peasant families and process them like livestock over the course of several days. They would butcher one family member each night, preparing different cuts for different courses, while forcing the surviving family members to serve the meals and watch their relatives being consumed by the nobility. These festivals would last for weeks, with nobles traveling from across the Holy Roman Empire to participate in what they considered the ultimate luxury dining experience. They would bring their own chefs to compete in preparing the most creative human dishes, turning mass murder into a cooking competition where the ingredients were someone's children, parents, and siblings. The Spanish Inquisition added a religious dimension to these practices, claiming that consuming the flesh of heretics would purify the soul of the consumer. They would perform elaborate blessing ceremonies over their human meals, treating cannibalism as a holy sacrament that brought them closer to God. Spanish nobles would fast for days before these ceremonial meals to ensure they could fully appreciate the spiritual nourishment of human flesh. Italian city-states developed the most sophisticated human cuisine in Europe. Venetian nobles would import live victims from across the Mediterranean, rating different nationalities like wine regions, claiming that Greeks had a more delicate flavor, that Turks were too gamey, that North Africans had the best marbling in their muscle tissue. They created elaborate rating systems for human meat that were more complex than modern wine classifications. The Medici family commissioned cookbooks dedicated entirely to human cuisine, with detailed illustrations showing proper butchering techniques, organ preparation methods, and presentation styles. These cookbooks were illuminated manuscripts, works of art that treated cannibalism as high culture. They were passed down through generations like family heirlooms, with each generation adding their own recipes and refinements. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how they involved their children in these practices. Noble children would be given small portions of human flesh as their first solid food, believing it would make them stronger and more noble. They would have their first human meal as a coming-of-age ceremony, like a communion service where the bread and wine were replaced with actual human flesh and blood. These children would grow up thinking this was normal cuisine, learning to distinguish between different types of human meat like modern children, learn to identify different vegetables. They would have favorite body parts, preferred preparation methods, and would throw tantrums when served regular animal meat instead of their preferred human dishes. The smell of cooking human flesh became as common in noble kitchens as any other meal preparation. Servants would be trained in human butchery like they were learning to prepare any other meat, with master chefs passing down techniques for tenderizing human muscle, rendering human fat, and preparing human organs that had been refined over generations of practice. They would preserve human meat using the same techniques used for other meats, smoking, salting, drying, creating human jerky, and preserved human sausages that could be stored for months and shared as gifts between noble families. Receiving a package of preserved human flesh from another noble family was considered a sign of deep friendship and respect. The logistics alone should make you sick. They had supply chains for human meat more efficient than most modern food distribution systems. They had preferred suppliers who would capture and prepare victims according to specific requirements, delivery schedules that ensured fresh meat arrived at the optimal time, and quality control standards that would be impressive if they weren't applied to human beings. And they documented everything. Detailed records exist of thousands of these meals, with menus, guest lists, and even reviews of the dining experience. They treated human flesh like any other luxury commodity, with market prices, seasonal variations, and consumer preferences all carefully tracked and recorded. These weren't monsters hiding in shadows. They were the cultural and religious leaders of European civilization. They built cathedrals while eating human hearts, commissioned religious art while serving human brain pâté, and created the philosophical foundations of modern European culture while treating cannibalism as the height of sophisticated dining. But this appetite for human consumption didn't disappear with the medieval period. The next time you see someone obsessing over luxury dining experiences, paying thousands for rare ingredients, treating food as a status symbol, remember those Borgia dinner parties. Remember the nobles, rating human flesh like wine vintages. And ask yourself, when we turn consumption into identity, when we make eating an expression of power and superiority, how different are we really from those cannibalistic courtiers who thought they were the pinnacle of civilization? You think we've reached the bottom of this cesspit of human depravity? You're still naive, because what I'm about to tell you will make everything else seem like gentle eccentricity. We need to talk about what European nobility did to children, not just their own, but any child they could get their hands on. And I'm warning you now, this is where the story becomes so dark that you'll question whether humanity deserves to exist at all. Picture this. It's 1480, and you're walking through the corridors of a Florentine palace owned by the Medici family. You hear something that stops your blood cold, children laughing and playing. But these aren't the sounds of innocent childhood joy. These are the calculated, trained sounds of children who have been systematically broken and rebuilt as living dolls for the entertainment of adults who have abandoned every shred of human decency. The Italian nobility created what they called living toy collections. They would kidnap children as young as 3 years old and surgically modify them to serve as permanent entertainment objects. They would remove vocal cords to prevent screaming, break and reset bones to create unnatural poses, and perform primitive brain surgeries to create docile, obedient creatures that existed solely for their owner's amusement. These children would be dressed in elaborate costumes that were sewn directly into their skin, making the clothing permanent. They would be trained to perform specific poses and expressions on command, like human marionettes controlled by nobles, who treated them as living art pieces. The children would be displayed in special rooms alongside other valuable objects, their humanity completely erased in favor of their entertainment value. Lorenzo de' Medici kept detailed records of his child collection, cataloging each victim by their specific modifications, performance capabilities, and artistic value. He would loan children to other noble families for special events, trade them like playing cards, and commission artists to paint portraits of his favorites in their permanently attached costumes. These portraits still hang in museums today, though curators have never revealed what they actually depict. The French court developed something even more twisted. They created child orchestras, using victims who had been systematically tortured to produce different musical notes when struck. Children would be kept in specially designed cages that positioned their bodies like musical instruments, with different bones and organs tuned to create specific pitches when beaten with mallets. Marie Antoinette herself was known to compose simple melodies by indicating which children should be struck in which order. The resulting music was considered the height of avant-garde composition, with nobles traveling from across Europe to hear these living instruments perform. The children rarely survived more than a few performances, but that was considered part of the artistic experience. The music would change as their bodies deteriorated, creating what the nobles called organic composition. German princes took child abuse to scientific levels, conducting what they called educational experiments to determine the limits of human suffering. They would subject captured children to systematic torture schedules, carefully documenting their psychological and physical responses to different types of pain, using this data to develop more efficient methods of breaking adult prisoners. These experiments were conducted in specially built laboratories within palace complexes, complete with observation galleries where nobles could watch and take notes like they were attending university lectures. Children would be subjected to increasingly extreme torments, while noble audiences discussed the philosophical implications of human suffering, treating agony as an intellectual exercise. The Holy Roman Empire created child factories, massive facilities where kidnapped children would be processed like manufactured goods. Different sections of these factories would specialize in different types of modification. One area for removing limbs, another for voice alteration, another for facial reconstruction. Children would move through these facilities on conveyor-like systems, with each station adding specific modifications according to the final product requirements. Spanish nobility, with the blessing of the Catholic Church, created purification centers, where they claimed to be saving children's souls through systematic torture. Children would be subjected to elaborate rituals designed to burn away their original sin through carefully applied pain, with church officials providing theological justification for every form of abuse imaginable. These centers operated like factories of suffering, with production quotas for how many children could be purified each day. The church provided detailed manuals describing proper purification techniques, complete with illustrations showing correct torture positions and theological explanations for why each form of agony was necessary for salvation. English nobility developed child gardens, landscaped areas where modified children would be arranged like living sculptures among the flowers and hedges. These children would be surgically altered to maintain specific positions permanently, then placed throughout elaborate garden designs where guests could stroll among them like they were viewing topiary art. The children in these gardens would be kept alive through primitive life support systems, fed through tubes, and maintained by specialized servants who treated them like valuable plants that needed careful tending. Nobles would host garden parties where guests would admire the artistry of human suffering, integrated into beautiful natural settings. Russian nobility created child libraries, where kidnapped children would be subjected to primitive lobotomies that left them able to memorize and recite text perfectly, but destroyed their ability to think or feel. These human books would be taught to recite poetry, literature, and philosophical works on command, serving as living storage devices for cultural knowledge. Nobles would collect these human libraries like book collections, with different children specializing in different types of literature. They would be displayed in specially designed rooms that looked like traditional libraries, but instead of books on shelves, there would be rows of brain-damaged children ready to recite whatever text their owners demanded. But perhaps the most horrifying practice was what the Habsburg family called genetic sculpting. They would kidnap children and attempt to breed them into specific physical forms through systematic torture and surgical modification. They believed they could create a race of perfect servants by breaking down children's natural development and rebuilding them according to aristocratic ideals. These breeding programs would span generations, with children being modified, bred, and their offspring further modified in an attempt to create ideal human forms. The facilities where this occurred were designed like agricultural research centers, with careful records kept of each generation's modifications and breeding results. The mortality rate for these programs was nearly 100%. Not a single child subjected to genetic sculpting survived to adulthood. But the programs continued for centuries because the nobles considered the research more valuable than the individual lives being destroyed. Austrian nobility created empathy removal ceremonies where they would systematically destroy children's ability to feel compassion or connection to other human beings. They believed that creating emotionally dead children would produce perfect servants who could carry out any order without hesitation or moral conflict. These ceremonies involved forcing children to torture other children while being rewarded for causing the most creative suffering. Children who showed any sign of empathy or hesitation would themselves become victims, while those who embraced cruelty would be elevated to positions where they could inflict even more damage. The children who survived these ceremonies became the perfect servants for noble families, completely obedient, creatively cruel, and utterly incapable of human connection. They would grow up to become the administrators of even more horrific programs, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of institutionalized child abuse that lasted for generations. The smell of these facilities, the combination of fear, pain, infection, and death, became so associated with European palaces that perfumers developed special fragrances to mask it. The sound of children screaming became such constant background noise in noble residences that acoustic engineers designed special wall materials to muffle it. And the documentation, thousands of pages of detailed records describing every experiment, every modification, every death. These nobles didn't hide their crimes. They were proud of them. They considered themselves pioneers of human development, scientists of suffering, artists of agony who were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with human flesh and spirit. They created instruction manuals for child modification that were more detailed than modern medical textbooks. They commissioned artists to create beautiful illustrations of their techniques. They held conferences where they would share their latest discoveries in human suffering, treating child torture like an academic discipline. These weren't monsters hiding in the shadows of history. They were the religious leaders, the cultural patrons, the political powers who shaped European civilization. They built the cathedrals, commissioned the art, and wrote the philosophy that we still study today, all while systematically destroying thousands of children in ways that would make modern horror movies seem tame by comparison. But this legacy lives on in ways you don't want to acknowledge. The next time you see systematic abuse of power over vulnerable populations, the next time you witness institutions that claim to help children while actually exploiting them, the next time you see people treated as objects rather than human beings, remember those child factories. Remember the living toy collections. And realize that the capacity for such evil didn't die with medieval Europe. It just learned to hide behind better institutions and more sophisticated language. We've reached the end of this journey through the darkest corridors of human history, but before you think you can simply close this chapter and pretend it never happened, I need to show you one final horror that will haunt you forever. Because everything I've told you, the filth, the torture, the cannibalism, the systematic destruction of children, all of it was just preparation for their ultimate achievement in human depravity. We need to talk about what European nobility did with death itself. You see, these weren't people who simply killed and moved on. They turned death into an art form, a science, a religion, and ultimately a way to achieve what they believed was immortality. And the methods they used to cheat death make everything else look like children's games played by amateurs who had no idea how deep the abyss of human evil could go. Let me take you to the catacombs beneath the Vatican in 1503, where Pope Alexander VI is conducting what he calls the final experiment. The air is thick with incense, but underneath that holy smell is something else, the sweet stench of decay mixed with chemicals that burn your nostrils and make your eyes water. Because tonight, surrounded by the bones of saints and martyrs, the most powerful religious leader in the world is about to attempt something that will make him a god among men. The Borgias had discovered that by systematically torturing victims in specific patterns while they died, they could extract what they called life essence, a substance they believed contained the victim's remaining years of life. They had turned murder into a precise science, with detailed charts showing which organs to damage in which order, how much pain to inflict at each stage, and exactly when to extract various bodily fluids to capture maximum life force. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was systematic research conducted over decades with the precision of modern medical experiments. They had developed specialized instruments for extracting life essence, built laboratories designed specifically for these procedures, and trained teams of technicians who could perform these extractions with surgical precision. The Pope himself would consume these life essences in elaborate rituals, believing that each victim's remaining lifespan would be added to his own. He kept detailed records of how many years he had stolen from each victim, calculating his expected lifespan based on the accumulated suffering he had consumed. By his own records, he believed he had extended his life by over 300 years through systematic murder. The French court took this necromantic science even further. They discovered that pregnant women produced a particularly potent form of life essence, especially if both mother and unborn child were killed simultaneously through specific torture methods. Marie Antoinette herself participated in these double extractions, believing that consuming the combined life force of a mother and child would not only extend her life, but enhance her beauty and intelligence. These procedures were performed in specially designed chambers beneath Versailles, with intricate machinery designed to capture and concentrate the life essence as it was extracted. The chambers were decorated with mirrors so that the victims could watch their own life force being drained, because the nobles believed that the victim's awareness of the process increased the potency of the essence. German princes developed what they called cascade extraction. They would chain together multiple victims and extract life essence from each one in sequence, believing that the fear and despair of watching others die would contaminate their own life force, creating a more powerful compound. Entire families would be processed this way, with children forced to watch their parents' life essence being extracted before their own turn came. The extraction process could take days, with victims kept alive through primitive life support while their essence was slowly drained. The nobles would often host viewing parties during these extended extractions, treating the slow death as entertainment while simultaneously harvesting what they believed was literal time stolen from their victims' lives. Spanish nobility, working with the Inquisition, claimed divine authority for their life essence extraction, arguing that they were collecting the souls of heretics to prevent them from reaching heaven. They would perform elaborate religious ceremonies during the extraction process, with priests blessing each stage of the torture while nobles consumed the extracted essence as a form of perverted communion. These ceremonies were held in converted churches, with altars specifically designed for life essence extraction. The irony was deliberate. They were literally consuming human souls in the same locations where they claimed to worship God, turning houses of worship into factories for stealing the most fundamental aspect of human existence. Italian city-states created vast underground networks of extraction facilities connected by tunnels that allowed them to transport victims between different locations for specialized procedures. Venice alone had over 50 active extraction sites, processing hundreds of victims each month in their quest to achieve immortality through systematic murder. These facilities were works of architectural marvel, designed with the same attention to detail as the great cathedrals above ground. They had specialized chambers for different types of extraction, storage areas for preserving essence, and laboratories for refining and concentrating the stolen life force. The nobles took as much pride in these death factories as they did in their palaces. The English developed mobile extraction units, horse-drawn carriages equipped with all the necessary tools for performing life essence extraction in remote locations. These death coaches would travel through the countryside, collecting victims from rural areas where disappearances were less likely to be investigated. Henry VIII personally owned 12 of these mobile units and would sometimes accompany them on their collection runs. But perhaps the most horrifying development was what the Habsburg family called generational extraction. They would capture entire bloodlines and extract life essence from each generation in sequence, believing that familial connections enhanced the potency of the stolen life force. They would keep detailed genealogical records to ensure they captured every member of a family line, sometimes hunting individual families for decades to complete their collections. Russian nobility took the concept even further, developing techniques for extracting life essence from victims while keeping them technically alive for years. They created what they called living batteries, victims who had been reduced to barely functioning biological systems that could continue producing life essence indefinitely. These human batteries would be maintained in specially designed facilities, their bodies kept alive through primitive medical intervention, while their life force was slowly harvested over extended periods. The most successful practitioners of life essence extraction lived for centuries, passing their techniques down through carefully selected apprentices who would continue their work. Some noble families have records suggesting their patriarchs lived for over 400 years, sustained entirely by the stolen life force of thousands of victims. The documentation is overwhelming. Detailed extraction manuals with precise illustrations, inventory records tracking thousands of victims, architectural plans for extraction facilities, and even early photographs showing the results of successful life essence consumption. These weren't myths or legends. They were systematic, documented procedures carried out by the most powerful people in European society. And here's what should terrify you most of all. They succeeded. Some of these nobles genuinely did extend their lives far beyond normal human lifespans. The techniques they developed were refined over generations, creating methods of cheating death that actually worked. The evidence suggests that some of these families may still be practicing these techniques today, hidden behind modern medical technology and sophisticated cover stories. The smell of those extraction chambers, that mixture of fear, pain, chemicals, and death, that smell still permeates certain locations throughout Europe. There are rooms in old palaces where sensitive visitors still report overwhelming sensations of despair and terror, places where the accumulated suffering of centuries has somehow soaked into the very stones. Think about that the next time you visit a European museum or tour a historic palace. Think about what might have happened in the rooms you're admiring, what kinds of machinery might have operated in the basements you'll never see, what techniques for stealing human life might have been perfected in the very buildings that now represent the pinnacle of human cultural achievement. These nobles didn't just live in luxury built on human suffering, they literally extended their lives by consuming the stolen time of their victims. They turned murder into medicine, torture into technology, and human agony into the fuel for their own immortality. They didn't just rule over people, they consumed people, absorbing their very essence to power their own extended existence, and that legacy didn't die with them. Every time you see someone treating other people as disposable resources, every time you witness systematic exploitation disguised as progress, every time you see institutions that seem to feed on human suffering while claiming to help, remember those extraction chambers. Remember the nobles who believed they could become gods by consuming enough human souls. Because the truth is, the capacity for such evil never disappeared. It just evolved. The extraction chambers became corporations that consume human labor and dignity. The life essence became the systematic harvesting of human potential for the benefit of the few. The noble families became modern dynasties that still treat ordinary people as nothing more than batteries to power their own extended dominance. We never stopped being prey. We just convinced ourselves that the predators disappeared when really they just learned to hunt with better camouflage. The European nobility didn't vanish into history. They became the invisible aristocracy that still feeds on human suffering, still extracts life essence from the masses, still believes that their existence justifies any amount of pain inflicted on others. So the next time you feel that strange exhaustion that comes from working for people who seem to drain the life out of you, the next time you sense that your energy is being harvested by systems that give nothing back, the next time you feel like your very soul is being consumed by forces you can't see or fight, remember what I've told you tonight. Remember that some hungers never die. Some techniques never disappear, some aristocracies never fall, they just learn to feed more quietly. And somewhere in the world tonight, in rooms you'll never see, using methods you can't imagine, the extraction continues. The only difference is that now, instead of individual victims chained to tables, we've created entire societies designed to harvest life essence on an industrial scale. The European nobility didn't lose their taste for human souls. They just figured out how to make all of us willing participants in our own consumption. Sweet dreams.